such a well paper, and then kind of what you've been doing since.
Yeah. In fact, we just had the other day, we had a seminar. It was online, but we had a seminar about the BIP with myself and Adina Roskies, and we talked about, what are some different ways you might interpret this thing, and why it's been a challenge to interpret it. And we're working on a paper about that actually right now.
Okay, about that question specifically.
About that question, yeah, why it's been such a challenge to interpret it, and on assumption that we haven't really cracked it yet, we don't really know yet what it is, what it represents for sure. On that assumption, then we're just looking at different possible ways of interpreting it and seeing what are the implications for each one of those, and what's the evidence for and against each one of those different interpretations of it. So I think we're really at a point. I mean, anyone who I think who says, "Oh, well, we know what that is," I think that's not honest. We don't really know. So this is it remains. We have a lot of data that some coming from this direction, some coming from another direction, and it's hard to make sense of it all. It's going to take some work to, I think, make sense of all the different data that we have, and come up with a really clear interpretation that we convince ourselves is the right one.
Yeah. So maybe shall we just start there then? So it seems to me, at least, that there was one predominant interpretation of the readiness potential.
Yeah, it's what we call the classic interpretation. So what the readiness potential really is a buildup in neural activity, a relatively slow buildup in neural activity that appears in the last roughly 1 second or so before you perform what I call a spontaneous voluntary movement, which means some people use the phrase self-initiated movement. So it's a movement that you make without a cue, without a sensory cue telling you, when to move. So when you perform a movement kind of on your own time, you get this. If you then if you time lock some brain data, for example, electroencephalography data or EEG data, if you time lock to the moment when you make the movement and you look backwards in time, you see this buildup happening before the movement. So part of the definition of what the readiness potential is involves the way it's measured. That is to say, it is almost by definition, it is something that you observe in the average after taking many movements, many data epochs that are time locked to the onset of the movement, taking many of those and averaging them together. And then you see this buildup. It's not something that you can really readily see by just looking at one instance of a movement. Certainly not with EEG.
And so there are, if I remember correctly, some studies, single cell recordings in humans and in animals. Do you see in readiness potential like signal in single cells there or not?
Yes, you do. You do, in fact. So there has been one study, one very nice study looking at single unit activity in areas, in premotor areas. So these are areas like the supplementary motor area and the pre-supplementary motor area. Those recordings were made from epilepsy patients. They were being monitored. So they had electrodes in their brain, implanted in their brain directly. Obviously, those are there for medical reasons. And the scientific study is something that's just done in addition, right? So the patients are asked, well, while you're in the hospital being monitored for epilepsy, may we observe the activity in your from those electrodes while you're performing this or that task. So yes, there are those data showing that when humans perform a self-initiated movement, you see this buildup in firing rate of individual neurons in premotor areas. You also see the same sort of buildup in advance of self-initiated movements in primates. And
sorry, just briefly, so you mentioned firing rates. So that means, so in the normal readiness potential, as we think of it, it's an aggregate in electrical potential, right? But so firing rate means it just gets more and more quick, or like less and less time between action potentials. Then
that's right. The neuron begins to fire faster and faster.
A similar kind of exponential increase, or
that it's hard to say if it's exponential or linear, but it's a ramp. It ramps up in advance of movement. Yeah. And so yeah, that we see that similar kind of ramping behavior again in other kinds of other species like primates, like rodents, and even in invertebrates like a crayfish. So they also have this ramping behavior they don't have, crayfish doesn't have cortex. Yeah. So you can't say it's in their motor cortex, but it's in a motor nucleus. Right, of the crayfish. So I think that's a very interesting and exciting data point. The fact that crayfish exhibit this tells us that it's not a cortical phenomenon because the crayfish doesn't have cortex, and it suggests that it's a much more primitive phenomenon. It's not something that uniquely evolved in vertebrates or mammals.
So I think we haven't actually finished the explanation of what the readiness potential then represents.
Right. So I like to call it, so when you measure it with EEG, we call it the readiness potential because it's an electrical potential measured at the scalp. When you record it, when you record from single neurons and you observe that their firing rate is getting faster and faster, we call that a readiness discharge. And when it's recorded, for example, with magnetoencephalography or MEG, we call it a readiness field because it's a change in the magnetic field. So the name we give it sort of depends on the way that you're recording brain activity. I call it the pre-movement buildup. So that just covers all of those. It's the same phenomenon, right? We're just measuring it in different ways. It's this pre-movement buildup. But for just so that that we understand that, we can call it the readiness potential. That's fine, the RP. But we're talking about something that's more general than that. It's right. It's not specific to EEG. So it appears right before self-initiated movements. We don't observe it. So when there is a cue to move and you're asked to respond quickly, you don't see this readiness potential. It's something that we've known about since about the mid 1960s. So 1965 was really first reported by Kornhuber and Deke. And I think they were in, I hope I get this right, in Freiburg at the time.
I think so. Yeah, I can't remember exactly.
Yeah. When they discovered it. And their interpretation of what this meant, it was, at the time, it was something completely radical. You before that seminal study, I don't think there were any examples of experimenters looking at brain activity when subjects performed movements without a cue, without a stimulus. So the whole edifice of psychology research was built around the stimulus response paradigm. So you provide a stimulus, you observe the response. And here were these two scientists who said, well, let's see what happens when there's just no stimulus, because you can act without a stimulus. And so they discovered that when they did that, lo and behold, they discovered this slow buildup before the onset of the movement, and they interpreted that to reflect the brain's planning and preparation for movement, which is a sensible conclusion to come to. Looks like the brain is getting ready to move. You lock the data to the time of movement, and you look at what's happening beforehand on average. You see this ramping behavior. Natural conclusion to come to is, well, this is the brain, again, quote unquote, planning and preparation for movement. And that's there hasn't really been any kind of formal model of what the readiness potential represents. But we call that the classic model of the readiness potential. It's the brain is gearing up to move. For some reason, the brain needs a little bit of time to gear up to move before you move. And that's what this ramp represents.
But only for self-initiated movements.
Right. Yeah. Right. Specifically for self-initiated movements, yeah. That became very controversial, right, in the 1980s when Libet did his seminal and very famous or infamous studies where he recorded the readiness potentials while subjects reported when in time they felt their urge to move. And that of course is now a classic study that's been very controversial and is very well known. But to make a long story short, I mean, Libet found that the time that people judge to have been conscious of their urge to move happened very close in time to the movement itself, maybe 0.2 of a second before the movement. Whereas the readiness potential is apparent quite a while before that, 500 milliseconds, half a second, or even a second before the movement. So if you take the readiness potential to reflect the brain's gearing up to move, then the conclusion you come to is, well, wait a minute, the brain seems to be gearing up to move before I'm even conscious of my own decision to move. And that's what I call Libet's paradox. It is just at face value, and it just seems kind of paradoxical, right? We all sort of assume that, first you decide and then your brain does its thing.
Yep.
Right? I mean, that makes sense. I mean,
that's not that controversial.
That's not so controversial. I mean, that's what you'd expect. And so this was pretty radical, right? It was like, well, no, it looks like your brain does its thing and then you decide, or then you feel like you decided.
Yeah. And I think Daniel Wegner's, I guess, way of putting it together was that didn't he say that basically the brain initiates two things separately? Once the actual movement, and separately also this conscious intention or urge to move.
Yeah.
And that then basically, because the intention or urge still comes before the action, and because we can't, internally feel our readiness potential,
right?
We think the urge caused it.
Right. We feel it's sort of, according to that view, it's just something that the brain tacks on after the fact, maybe just to make us feel good, to make us feel like we're
in control,
consciously doing these things. I mean, Libet's conclusion was that, well, movements they must be initiated unconsciously, and then the conscious decision comes on as an afterthought, or after the fact. So that's been controversial ever since it appeared in the early 1980s, and people are still arguing and debating to this day, still arguing and debating Libet's experiment, and why it was. I mean, it was, one of the, just for example, I mean, one of the criticisms was that the task is just completely strange and weird, and nobody does anything like that in real life. You're asked, basically, Libet asked his subjects to be spontaneous, which is a weird instruction, right? Asked them, well, just, sit there and wait a little while, and when you feel ready, just move your finger. It is a weird instruction. It is kind of goofy. I've done his experiment many times with subjects, and the fact is, as goofy as that task is, subjects can do it. And they do it just fine. At first, they kind of look a little confused, and they're not sure what to do, but you explain it. You say, just, one thing I often tell them is, I say, well, kind of try to surprise yourself if you can do that. Don't think in advance. Don't think, okay, I think I'm gonna move now. Don't do that. Don't count. Don't say, all right, I'm gonna move in 5 seconds. Don't do that either. Just try to just keep your mind blank, and at some random moment, just surprise yourself and lift your finger. And subjects do it, so they get the hang of it, and then after a while, they're fine. And then they can do that for an hour.
I'm curious with these, if so, let's say you have a participant and they do, I don't know, 100 trials an hour or whatever. Do you find that they have some sort of normal distribution as around a certain average waiting time or something like that they basically reinterpret the confusing task into something like, wait 6 seconds plus minus a few seconds delay, or?
Right. What's interesting is that the distribution of their waiting times is pretty well fit by a gamma distribution, not a normal distribution. So a gamma distribution looks like a normal distribution, except that it has this, it's skewed a little bit, and it's skewed a little bit and has this long tail on the right. So you have a tendency to make movements around a certain, let's say 5 seconds, 6 second mark. But then you have a bunch of, occasional movements that are 10 seconds or even 15 seconds, but ever fewer of those. And what's interesting about that is that it's the very same distribution that is commonly used to fit reaction times when there is a stimulus. Of course, the time scale is much shorter, but the distribution, the shape of the distribution is very much the same.
Does that tell us anything, or does it seem like a coincidence?
No, I absolutely think it does. So if we've covered, if you think we've covered enough of the basics so far, then what we proposed back in 2012 was that the brain uses the same mechanism for doing this kind of task, like Libet's task, just spontaneous movement. Uses the same mechanism there that it does in a regular perceptual decision-making task where you do have a stimulus. Except that in this case, there is not much in the way of a signal. There is no sensory signal, right? There's no stimulus. There's just noise. So when you model decision-making in that kind of a task, in a perceptual decision-making task, where you have a stimulus, you include signal in that model. So that would be the stimulus itself, and noise, which can reflect noise in the stimulus or noise in the brain, or a combination. So we thought, well, maybe the readiness potential can be accounted for using this same sort of mechanism. And in fact, that might explain why, for example, the distribution of waiting times has the same shape as the distribution of reaction times in a perceptual decision-making task. And it has the same roughly linear relationship between mean and variance as well. So we used that kind of a model to try and represent or to model the readiness potential. The idea, and this gets to a really important point, is that in a task like Libet's, when you think about it in those terms, right, in terms of evidence and noise and a threshold, right, in these kind of models, you have a decision threshold. So you have a combination of evidence and noise that build up, and when they reach that threshold, that's the moment where you decide and you execute the movement. So in that kind of situation, normally the evidence is quite dominant. You have a stimulus that's quite visible. In the case of the Libet task, the evidence is, well, there isn't really any evidence, right? You're asked to just move just for the heck of it. So what evidence is there really? I'll come back to that. There is, I think, a tiny bit of evidence, or a tiny bit of something that you can consider to be like evidence. But for all practical purposes, let's say there's just noise. One way to achieve that task, one way to comply with those instructions, is to bring the noise floor up closer to whatever your decision threshold is, and then just wait, and wait until the threshold is crossed at a random moment, right? When we use the model in that way, so we have mostly noise climbing towards a threshold and then getting close to the threshold and then waiting until it randomly crosses. If you take those trajectories, when I say trajectory, I mean how that decision variable climbs up towards the threshold, and you time lock to the moment of threshold crossing, and you average them together, they fit the shape of the readiness potential remarkably well. So you have this sort of, exponential looking ramp up to a threshold. We were able to literally fit the shape of a real empirically measured readiness potential using that kind of model. So the idea is that when the evidence or the imperative to make a movement is weak, then the precise moment at which that threshold is crossed, at which the decision threshold is crossed, leading to movement, is largely determined by subthreshold random fluctuations in the neural activity in the motor system. And so if you time lock to the moment of movement initiation, which we presume to be the moment of threshold crossing, then you're going to recover not the brain gearing up to move. No, you're going to recover the noise. You're going to recover the characteristics of that noise, which we know in brains and in other natural systems tend to be dominated by lower frequencies. So you're going to recover a slow, gradual build up to the threshold. So we were able to fit then the shape of the readiness potential with that. And very interestingly, if we took the distribution of first crossing times in the model, so the first moment at which the model the decision variable crossed the threshold in the model and looked at that distribution, it fit the distribution of waiting times for that subjects exhibited doing this task.
So this kind of gamma distribution,
and fit in a very similar way, exhibited the same sort of linear relationship between the variance and the mean. So we were able to fit both the behavioral aspects of this task and the brain data using the same model with the same parameters in both cases. The only extra ingredient that I haven't mentioned so far, which I said I would come back to, is this imperative or evidence, right? So there's no stimulus in this task, so to speak, but there is an imperative to move, a weak one, which is the demand characteristics of the task.
You mean the kind of like you're supposed to make a movement at some point,
right? The phrase demand characteristics, right, refers to the kind of unspoken unspoken imperatives in so the subject is coming into the lab, and they're coming into the lab to do an experiment about movement. They're being asked to do a task where they're asked to move their finger at a random moment. So even though you tell them, well, you can wait as long as you want to lift your finger, it's just up to you, just whenever you feel ready, just spontaneously move your finger, but there are no rules about when you have to move your finger. You're effectively telling subjects that they could wait an hour if they wanted to, or they could just sit there and never move, and then you, after a couple hours, you say, okay, thank you, and send them home. They could do that. You've given them full permission to do that, but they never.
I've heard of people who actually do that.
Yeah, well, you get an occasional.
Pressed it 3 times in an hour.
Yeah, you get an occasional smartass, but most people, the vast majority of people, they move after, at the very most, 30 seconds maybe, and very rarely that long. So without having to tell the subjects explicitly, there's this sort of unspoken agreement that, look, I'm telling you to move whenever you want to, but move, okay?
Yeah.
Move sooner or later, right?
It would be good if you actually felt this urge at some point.
It would, yeah, exactly. It would. I'd really appreciate it if you did feel the urge, before too long. So there is an imperative to move, and that's captured in the model. So the model does have this term that usually gets assigned the sensory evidence, the weight of the sensory evidence. For example, if you were looking at a visual grading on the screen, the contrast in that grading might be modeled as the weight of the evidence.
Sorry, what does that mean? I'm not that familiar with these perceptual tasks.
Well, a grading is just an area on the screen where you have alternating black and white stripes. And then you can have those at different shades of gray rather than black and white. And so you can, black and white would be maximum contrast, right? And then as you go towards, a darker and a lighter shade of gray, and you keep reducing the difference in luminance between the darker and the lighter stripes, that's lowering the contrast until there's no contrast, and then you can't see it at all. So that you could call that the evidence, or the weight of the evidence. In the case of a task like Libet's, well, we said, well, there's no stimulus, there's no sensory stimulus, but the quote unquote evidence, well, that's coming from these demand characteristics, and it's weak. It's not, again, there's not a strong imperative to move. You can move anytime you want, reasonably soon. So okay.
Can't you model that, or can't you infer that based on how often people actually pressed during the experiment? Like someone who pressed like lots of times you might assume would have a higher perceived imperative than someone who only pressed a few times?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So that's I mean, when you model those data, yeah, you can take each individual's distribution of waiting times and model that separately, and some have their mean waiting time is shorter than others. That would correspond in the model to them having a slightly stronger imperative. So there is this weak imperative to move, and in the model, that's what sort of helps to drive the system up a little bit closer to threshold, so that eventually a movement is produced, or eventually the threshold is crossed. So again, I mean, what the model says then is when that imperative to move is weak, then the precise moment when the threshold is crossed is largely determined by sub-threshold random fluctuations in the motor system, in the signal.
How did you how did you get to start this project? Because if I remember correctly, you did in your PhD, I think you did mainly consciousness or something like that. It seems.
Yeah, I did perception research and consciousness research.
I was perception. Okay, because then I mean, like the one thing that I found slightly just somewhat surprising is that, from as far as I can tell, neither you nor Jaco nor Stan had done anything with volition or had published anything on volition, and then you offered like a very new take on the readiness potential from a field that it seems like neither of you three were even doing at the time.
That's
so
true.
How did you come to actually do this project and kind of have this perspective on what the readiness potential might be?
I knew about the history. I knew about Kornhuber and Deka's study. I knew about Libet's study. It was very famous in the field, and I think for some reason, I mean, for some reason that particular area of research surrounding Libet's studies in the 1980s for whatever reason has found its way into this crowd that I kind of hang out with, crowd of colleagues and researchers who are, I mean, mostly a lot of what we have in common is exhibited by our membership in the ASSC, the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which is before COVID was a group that would meet once a year, and it's great. It's a great meeting. It's a great meeting of the minds. It happens once a year, and colleagues from a lot of different disciplines, but who are have a serious interest in consciousness research, come together, and in those circles, for whatever reason, even though, well, I mean, Libet's study has this element, right, about consciousness. I mean, the idea that you're conscious of your decision after the brain seems to start gearing up for the movement. So I had been exposed to, Libet's study and the controversies surrounding it a lot throughout the years. And for me, this was one of those things where there came a point where I wondered, I felt like there was something wrong with that explanation, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And so that kind of stewed for a long time, a couple of years, just this feeling that there was something not right, not quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it. And then I remember then distinctly at a lecture, I was at a lecture where someone was lecturing about the readiness potential, and he was making a point about the brain getting ready for movement, and here was this sign, and I at some point I raised my hand and asked the question, well, wait a minute, I mean, what if the readiness potential doesn't mean that you're getting ready to move? And then I was suddenly, I realized, yeah, what if it doesn't? I mean, the question just came to me, and I think those couple of years of that sort of stewing under the surface, eventually I asked the obvious question. It's like, well, wait a minute.
You questioned the assumption.
I questioned the assumption, even though it seems so obvious. And so I started thinking more about it, and I really can't say how the idea finally came to me. I was messing around with auto-correlated data, so data that has this auto-correlated noise. Sorry, it's noise that has this slow. It's dominated by the lower frequencies and has it's pink noise. What is often called pink noise. And I thought, well, what if the readiness potential doesn't mean that the brain is getting ready to move? What could it mean? And I thought, well, let's take a step back, and let's say I was an engineer and I was asked to build a robotic arm that could do Libet's task. How would I do it?
Okay, that's a good question. Yeah.
How would I do it? Because I was interested in the fact that in spite of the fact that the task is really weird, Libet's task is, again, subjects do it. So that begs the question: how does the brain do it? I mean, there are probably more than one ways of solving that problem, but okay, it's a fair question, right? How does the brain do it? So I thought, if I had to build a robotic arm that does the task, how might I do it? I thought, well, the first and simplest answer that came to my mind was, I would take the actuator and turn up the gain until it was very close to the threshold for actuating a movement of the arm, and then just wait. And sooner or later, it'll just make a movement. And in fact, assuming that the robotic arm, that the actuator in the robotic arm doesn't have direct access to its own internal noise, it'll be spontaneous, even from the point of view of the arm itself. The arm, that whole system will be basically surprising itself, right? Well, that is a solution to the problem of doing Libet's task. Is it the solution that the brain uses? I don't know, but it's a solution. So that was really the starting point. And I thought, well, what happens if I take auto-correlated noise and I set a threshold that's not too high, or I just bring the baseline of that noise up closer to threshold, either way, and just wait. And then if I time lock to those threshold crossings and I look at the average shape of the noise as it's approaching the threshold, and when I first did that, that just totally blew me away. I said, but that's the readiness potential.
Yeah.
I was just, at that point, I was just messing around, and then I saw the readiness potential on my screen, and I had gotten it just by playing around with this really silly, simple model. So that then it all started to come together. I thought, well, then maybe the readiness, maybe my, this gut feeling I had that there's just something not quite right about all that. It's exactly that. The readiness potential doesn't necessarily have to mean that your brain is getting ready for something.
Yeah, and in a way you have a much simpler explanation, right? Just random fluctuations that cross the threshold, and then using a bit of statistics makes it looks like this kind of ramping up, even though that's just an artifact of the way we analyze the data.
Yeah, exactly.
Although then my question is, so, and this now goes back to my question earlier about single cell recordings in humans and animals. So there you don't average across many trials, right? I think you said you have this increase of neural activity. Is it then more something like the input then has
no,
this...
you also average over many trials.
Oh, you do average. Oh,
units.
sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I thought it meant like... I see.
I mean, you do. If you look at a single trial, you can vaguely see a some slight, increase in firing rate leading up to the movement. But if you look at a raster plot, you can see it's very noisy.
I guess somehow I thought as soon as it was single cell, it was also single trial. Somehow I made this like two assumptions at the same time.
No, it's those, you still average together many trials to get this nice ramping shape. On any one given trial, it's still quite noisy.
Okay, well, that answers my question. I was going to ask like how you can combine these, like how your theory can be correct or your model can be correct even on these single trial levels. But if that's not what you meant, then
right, it applies.
That completely answers it.
Yeah, the same explanation can account for increase, the buildup in single unit firing rate. But there are some assumptions that have to hold, and for example, there would have to be a sort of baseline firing rate in those neurons that was above 0, so that there's room for it to fluctuate up and down. If the firing rate of those neurons is just basically pegged at 0 all the time, and then suddenly it starts to ramp upwards, then it's difficult to argue that that's just noise that's spontaneously, randomly crossing a threshold. But you do typically have a non-zero firing rate in most neurons, in fact, in the brain. But that's something that hasn't been formally tested yet. So that's one way that you could challenge the model, is to show that. So I think that's one of the strong points of the model, is that it's something that you could empirically test and you could disprove it. But I think the important thing about it is that it, in my mind, is much more parsimonious than the classical model, and so I think the burden of proof rests with first disproving this more parsimonious explanation before you go on to an explanation that involves the brain taking a second to get ready for a movement.
Which is also not an explanation at all.
I guess it's not really an explanation, but it's a description, yeah.
So one question I have right now is that it seems to me that your model is much more, it seems to me that applies to many more situations than just a movement. So that in any kind of decision making where you basically, you could say you have no evidence for, so you have two options, you have to choose between A or B, but you could also say maybe you have no preference, like you don't care which one you take, so you need some sort of, it seems to me almost like it's just like a random number generator where you just, that you use, like to flip a coin between two options. So do you think that this model then therefore makes the readiness potential much more general, that you also might find in non-movement situations?
Yes. So sure. You should basically the general idea applies in any situation where some sort of event is determined by a threshold crossing, and that happens in the presence of autocorrelated noise, then in any such system, if you time lock to the moments of the threshold crossing, you'll see this kind of buildup in advance. So that means that you could, maybe you could find something like a readiness potential in the stock market.
Yeah, that's one question I had. I saw you had like a paper on that, which I was just really surprised to see that. Can you briefly talk about that?
Yeah, so I worked with someone who's in finance, and he came up to me after a talk I gave at a conference and was very interested in this idea, and I thought, well, I had thought about it for some time as well, that in kind of any system, it doesn't really have to be a brain, any system that exhibits autocorrelated noise, and where some decision is dependent on a threshold crossing, then you'll get, if you time lock to the threshold crossing, you'll recover the characteristic, say quote unquote shape of the noise, which will look like a buildup. And so we thought, well, maybe we could look at stock market data and see if there's, we tried to think of what's the analogous situation. There's an event. The event could be, a buy, or a sell, or it could be, what we looked at as events, in fact, were when some indicator in the market crosses its own 50-day moving average, which for some reason that I even don't understand is something that people look at to help make decisions about when to buy and sell. I think even Patrick agrees, and others agree, that this is not more than just reading the tea leaves. And people still do it all the time. There are traders who, they look at these things and they say, oh yeah, when it crosses the 50-day moving average, that means something. That's a special, and that means you should do X, Y, or Z. And so, whether it means something or not, I don't know, but it is something that people use. So it's a trigger for a lot of traders. So we looked at that, and we tried to look for a buildup in something called excess volatility leading up to those events. We did find some evidence for it, but I would say it's not conclusive. But there are so many ways that you could look at stock market data that I think we've only just scraped the surface a little bit.
Is this a project you're continuing?
I mean, not right at the moment, but I'll probably continue looking at ways in which this same sort of idea might appear in different contexts, like weather forecasting, for example. So you might.
What would Can you? What's the word?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you have.
Elaborate. That's the word.
Can you elaborate? Yeah, I mean, you have, again, trying to take some situation and break it down into an event, and then some underlying variables that determine the onset time of that event, and where the kind of fluctuations in those variables are autocorrelated. Then there should be something like a buildup in advance. So in meteorology, you have variables like barometric pressure, for example, that or temperature. These are all very much autocorrelated. So temperature, for example, is very, very autocorrelated. If you look at temperature over a 30-day period or 60 or 90-day period, you can see that the best predictor of the temperature tomorrow is the temperature today, right? And so if you ask a young child, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? If they just say same as today, they'll actually be right a lot more often than they'll be wrong. So there is those, those variables are autocorrelated. So, it would be interesting to see if some event like the onset of rainfall, for example, then we would predict that it would be preceded by this same shape, this sort of exponential looking buildup.
So what are we, basically what's on our X and Y axes right now? If we imagine, I'm just trying to figure out, are you saying how much rain? Sorry, what's the threshold?
So let's say, event, I mean, this, I should qualify it. I haven't actually done any of this yet, this kind of work. This is just a half-baked idea at this point, but I've gotten as far as downloading the database of second by second weather data, which took an awful long time because it's a lot of data to download. The idea would be, for example, something like this. And again, I might be off on this, but for example, you might take the onset of rainfall as your event, and your variable might be, say, barometric pressure, and that's fluctuating about. We know that barometric pressure tends to drop before the onset of rainfall. The question is, can you model that using the same sort of model where, right, where barometric, well, I mean, the key is that sometimes maybe barometric pressure drops even though it doesn't rain. That would be the important point. But you have this variable that's fluctuating randomly.
Yeah, I think I get what you mean.
Temporally autocorrelated. And then there's an event, right? Which would be, well, it wasn't raining and now it is. That's an event.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious, really, more than anything else, to see if this really, if it doesn't appear in just other systems in nature.
Yeah, this actually relates to a question I wanted to ask in general, which is, one thing I always liked about how you approach, I guess, science in general, is that it seems to me you always take a very interdisciplinary approach, and kind of, it seems to me, at least compared to many other people I speak to, how your inspirations seem to be a more broader. And I'm curious, like, for example, like I think that at least to me, it seems like the natural thing to do when you have like this model of the readiness potential is to look at other, decision making, like you move one small step, you slightly change the task or something, and then you get like, sometimes very similar. But you now went like, not even outside of psychology, you went outside of like living beings.
Right.
You went right into meteorology. So was that like a, how should we say, was that like an intentional thing to see like how far can I take this, or like, for example, like, yeah, why study the weather and something else?
That sort of thing occurred to me by doing the kinds of simulations I was doing, and working with autocorrelated noise and a threshold. I mean, I saw it in front of me on my computer screen, and what I saw at some point, I said, well, that's just autocorrelated noise. That doesn't have to be brain noise, or it doesn't have to be EEG noise. It would seem that anywhere that, this ought to come up anywhere that you have autocorrelated noise and a threshold, and you ought to see this. But it is true. I've always liked to think and work with people who are working in other disciplines and think kind of broadly and get a little crazy. I don't really know why. I just always liked that. The measurement that we used in some studies on brain activity in perception came from a method that was used to measure the persistence of ocean currents. It turns out it mathematically it works extremely well to measure other things as well, like patterns of brain activity.
So it's just something you, just kind of naturally think about or are drawn towards.
I guess, yeah. I mean, you have to be. I have to be careful not to get too distracted, because at the end of the day, I'm doing neuroscience, and I have to stick with what I know, and not just go off on some tangent. I would never get anything done, right?
I guess we have like 50 minutes left or something.
20 minutes,
Shall we maybe then just talk about like what you're doing now or in the next, or want to do in the next few years or something? I guess some of the stuff we mentioned probably will be part of that, but as you mentioned, you also do psychology and neuroscience. So there is still that. So what are you planning to do there or are doing right now?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of these. So, like I said, I think, and this came up in a talk that I just gave with Adina Roskies, that the bottom line is, I think when it comes to the readiness potential and this buildup, what we need, I think, right now is just intellectual humility. Just we don't really know what this is. We have there's this classic model which has a lot of problems, and there are lots of reasons to criticize it. There's this stochastic model that we introduced in 2012 that maybe is more parsimonious, but it's not perfect either. Who knows? Maybe the reality is that there's some fraction of the variance is accounted for by stochastic fluctuations, but then there's some other stuff mixed in there, and it could be that some subjects do the task in a different way than others. I mean, it almost certainly there are other things mixed in. I mean, if you're doing a task like Libet's and you say, well, on every trial you start over again and you say ready, set, go, and then you wait as long as you want to wait, and then you lift your finger, right? When you do the task, and I can just, speaking for myself, when I do the task or have done the task in the past, you start thinking, well, on the last couple of trials I waited kind of a long time, so maybe this time I should not wait so long, right? Trying to be random. So there's that kind of strategizing that can go on, and that can factor into it. And we found in our data that you're watching a clock while you do this. You're monitoring a fast-moving clock, and the clock makes it goes once around every 3 seconds. So it's 50 milliseconds per second on the clock. And when you're doing that, it turns out for whatever reason, subjects tend to have a preference for the bottom of the clock. So on average, movements tend to be made more often around the bottom of the clock than the top. Who knows why? And there's some persistence in these behavioral data. So subjects if you waited a long time on this trial, you're more likely to wait a long time on the next trial. So there's some long range. There's some sort of memory, if you want to call it that. And so that there are all these different factors, right? That they're all playing into this mix together. I mean, there's a recent study showing that when people do this task, they tend overwhelmingly to move in phase with their own breathing. So that you tend, and in particular, you tend to plant your finger, you tend to make the movement when you're towards the end of your exhalation cycle. And by no means do you have to instruct people to do this. You don't ever say anything about breathing before the experiment starts. Subjects just naturally do that. And when you think about it, it sort of feels natural, like breathe in, breathe out, press. It kind of feels...
Yeah. Who'd press like at the beginning of breathing out? Yeah, that's weird.
So, it could be that the readiness potential it reflects many different things that are all sort of cobbled together. But the important point is that we don't know. We don't know what it reflects, and I think that if the work we published in 2012 had any effect, it was to just sort of throw a wrench in the works and to say, look, we don't really know what this is. Let's set about trying to come up with some different explanations and try and figure it out. And so one of the things we're looking at, for example, is that again, the readiness potential is something that you observe on the average after you average together many trials, and in fact, it's something that really takes shape when you take the average across many subjects, many participants. If you look at individual participants in the experiment, the shapes of those readiness potentials is as unique as the subjects are themselves. I mean, everybody's is a little different. And what's interesting is this canonical sort of exponential looking ramping shape that you see in the average across many subjects. It's hard to find an individual subject who has a readiness potential with that shape. There are, you'll have in any group, there will be a few, but then they're just, you've got every kind of crazy shape and all the way to the extreme of where you have some subjects who just don't have a readiness potential at all. They still do the task just fine.
Just kind of a
flat line, and then all of a sudden at the very end there's a spike, which is, obviously the motor cortex at some point becomes engaged. You're always going to have that, right? But yeah, so one thing that bears explaining, I think, is why some subjects don't even have a readiness potential, and what does that mean? So explaining the variance across subjects is I think that's very worthwhile, and I think that whatever comes of that, it will help us to better understand what the RP means, right? And trying to look at, in general, the factors that influence the shape and amplitude and onset of the RP, and there are still, there are more predictions that the stochastic model makes that we could test to see, for example, it predicts that the readiness potential should be have a different shape depending on how long you waited before you moved.
You should be able to analyze that with existing data.
So we have looked at it in one study. That's published, actually. We did find a difference, but that bears.
So which paper is that?
That's in 2018. That's a 2018 paper in eNeuro, and we did find that, but that bears replicating, I think, and looking into some more. So I think there's a lot to do. There's a lot that can be done, but I think what we should be focusing on is just trying to explain what this reflects. One thing I guess I should say, one thing that we've been looking at recently is the role that anticipation might play in the readiness potential. So there is, to make things more, not less confusing, there is another cortical potential called the SPN, the stimulus preceding negativity, which is another sort of shallow, slow buildup that looks very much like the readiness potential, at least in the earlier, a little bit earlier in time. As you get closer to the event, the readiness potential becomes more lateralized, and the SPN doesn't become so lateralized towards the end. But the early phase of it, they're almost indistinguishable. The SPN is something you get when you're just anticipating the arrival of a stimulus.
So you mean, like, let's say you see something every 2 seconds or something?
Yeah, or if you see something 2 or 3 seconds after a specific cue. So let's say the fixation cross changes color, and then you know that in exactly 2 seconds, something's going to appear on the screen. So for those 2 seconds, you're anticipating it, you're waiting for it, and then it appears. You get this buildup that looks very much like the readiness potential. So we wondered, well, maybe, I mean, if there's anything fundamental in all of this, it seems that it's anticipation that all of these contexts have in common. So when you're performing a movement, even in Libet's task, you are anticipating, you can't help it. I doubt that the brain could help but anticipate your own movement, right? No one can predict probably what your brain is going to do next better than your brain. So it's probably anticipating your own movement, and not just that, but it's anticipating the proprioceptive consequences of that movement. Feeling the button, well, I should say the sensory and proprioceptive consequences of that movement. So you're anticipating the click, the button is going to maybe click, and maybe something's going to change on the screen when you press that button. So there's all these sensory consequences, but yeah, there's proprioceptive consequences. You know, the skin is going to stretch on your finger, the muscle's going to flex, joint positions will be different. So I think it's a very reasonable assumption that your brain is anticipating that confluence of events, and so maybe the early part, at least, of the readiness potential reflects that anticipation. So we did an experiment where we tried to control for anticipation. So we had subjects do this task where they were watching a slideshow and just pretty pictures, and they on some trials, for some pictures, they have to press a button to advance to the next photo in the slideshow. And sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just had to wait and the slide would advance by itself after several seconds. And the time that would elapse on those automatic trials was drawn from their own distribution of waiting times on the trials where they advanced the slide themselves, so that by the end of the experiment, you had these epochs in time that either ended with a movement or ended without a movement, but they were well matched in terms of how much time elapsed. And so when we look at those data and we try then using some very powerful machine learning techniques to distinguish between those movement and those no movement epochs, we can't until roughly the moment that the movement is about to start.
So when you actually get like the motor cortex,
when the motor cortex really starts to become engaged, then you can start to tell them apart, but not before that. As if that anticipation was accounting for most of the variance potentially in both cases. And you might say, well, that's just a null result. You couldn't tell the difference until the time of movement. But there are two things speak against that. One is that at the time of movement, you can tell them apart exceedingly well, like near perfect, which is rare in machine learning. And also when we don't control for anticipation, when we do the analysis in a slightly different way, where we compare the signal to itself earlier in time. So we take
from the same trial, or
yeah. So we take a piece of signal from early in time and we say, well, this is 3 seconds before any movement happened. So we'll call this a no movement piece of data. And then we'll take other windows of data that are progressively closer to the time of movement and compare them using the same machine learning technique. And so when we do it that way, so here we're just looking at the movement trials, then we can tell, we can distinguish these movement and no movement epochs extremely well, even well in advance, even a full second in advance, when we don't control for anticipation. So it's not like the machine learning algorithm doesn't work.
It really seems to struggle between those two conditions.
Right. So that suggests maybe that anticipation is is a big part of the readiness potential. Maybe the early part, who knows? For all we know, maybe the early part of the readiness potential is dominated, is some sort of anticipation signal.
Which is quite ironic, isn't it? Because the whole point of the readiness potential is that it's something that's it's kind of a voluntary thing that isn't cue driven, right? But it seems to me almost you're saying it's driven to a cue you're about to expect, almost, even if that is self-generated.
Even if that is your own movement. Yeah. And there could, that doesn't preclude the stochastic explanation, because it could simply be that the level of anticipation in your brain is waxing and waning kind of randomly, and that co-varies with the actual probability that you will make a movement, from a sort of predictive coding standpoint, right? So it remains to be seen, but we're looking at this from whatever angles we can, including angles that might ultimately cast doubt even on what we suggested in 2012. The point is not to be right. The point is to get it right. And so that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, cool. I think we're pretty much running out of time.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks again for doing the recording.
You're welcome. You're welcome.